Before we dive into this intense and emotional story, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more gripping stories. Also, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. Now, let's get started. The moment Elena Carter stepped into the grand foyer of the Hayes estate, she felt the weight of expectation settle on her shoulders. The marble floors gleamed beneath the crystal chandelier. The air smelled of polished wood and fresh-cut roses, and yet the house felt eerily cold, like a museum rather than a home. She had married Richard Hayes barely 6 months ago, swept up in a whirlwind romance that felt too perfect to question. He was powerful, successful, and generous, showering her with everything a woman could ask for, everything except emotional warmth. Elena had convinced herself that love could grow in time, that marriage was about stability, not passion. But as she stood in that grand house, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that she had walked into something she wasn't prepared for. And then she met him. Damian Hayes stood at the top of the staircase, his tall frame leaning casually against the railing, arms crossed. His dark eyes, so similar to his father's, were unreadable as they swept over her, assessing, calculating. He was 21, only a few years younger than her, but the way he carried himself made it clear that he was no boy. Elena. Richard's voice pulled her attention back. He walked toward his son, clapping a firm hand on his shoulder. Meet Damien, my son. Son. The word felt oddly heavy. She had known about Damien, of course. Richard had spoken about him in passing, always with a hint of frustration, a rebellious streak, a tendency to push back. But nothing could have prepared her for the man in front of her now. Elena Carter, Damien said, his lips curling slightly as he spoke her name, as if he found it amusing. So, you're the new Mrs. Hayes. There was something in his voice, something just shy of mocking. Elena forced a polite smile. I am. Damien held her gaze for a second too long before turning away. Welcome to the family, I guess. His words were dismissive, but there was an undercurrent of something else, something unreadable. That night, as she lay in the massive bed beside her husband, listening to his steady breathing as he slept, she couldn't stop thinking about Damien. There was something about him that unsettled her, something that made her pulse quicken. She told herself it was just nerves, just the awkwardness of adjusting to a new life, a new family. She had no idea that it was the beginning of something dangerous. Days passed, and despite her best efforts, Elena couldn't seem to get past Damien's cold exterior. He was polite, but distant, respectful, yet detached. Richard, always busy with work, barely noticed. He left early, returned late, and when he was home, his attention was on business calls rather than his new wife. One evening, as Elena prepared dinner in the kitchen, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to find Damien leaning against the counter, watching her. You don't have to do that, he said, gesturing to the knife in her hand as she chopped vegetables. We have staff for that, she shrugged. I like cooking. It makes the house feel more real. Damien's lips twitched, as if he found the idea amusing. And does that work? Does this place feel real to you? Elena hesitated. I'm still getting used to it. Damien nodded, pushing off the counter and walking closer. My dad's good at giving people beautiful cages. You're not the first. His words sent a chill through her. Was that a warning? A test? I knew what I was getting into, she said, but even to her own ears, it sounded unconvincing. Damien smirked. Did you? And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he walked away, leaving Elena with a strange tightness in her chest. The tension between them grew, silent but undeniable. It was in the way their eyes met across the dinner table, in the accidental brushes of fingertips when passing each other in the hall. One night, after another long evening of Richard working late, Elena stepped out onto the balcony for some fresh air. The cool night breeze swept over her skin, offering a brief moment of peace. Then she heard the door open behind her. She turned to find Damien standing there, his gaze unreadable in the dim light. He took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. "You don't look happy," he said. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "That's a dangerous assumption." "Maybe," he said, tilting his head slightly. "But I'm right, aren't I?" Elena didn't answer. She didn't want to answer. Damien's voice was quieter when he spoke again. "Do you ever wonder if you made the wrong choice?" Her breath caught. She should have walked away, should have ended the conversation right then and there. Instead, she looked up at him, and in that moment, surrounded by the night, by the silence, something shifted between them. Something she should not have allowed. But it was already too late. Elena couldn't stop thinking about that night on the balcony, about the way Damien had looked at her, not with the cold indifference she had first assumed, but with something else, something unreadable, yet intoxicating. She told herself it was nothing, a passing moment, a meaningless exchange. But deep down, she knew better, and so did he. Days passed, and the house felt different. Or maybe it was just her. Richard was still as absent as ever, buried in work, barely noticing when she sat beside him at dinner or when she went to bed alone. The only presence that felt real in the house was Damien's. He was always there, passing her in the hallways, watching her from across the room. He didn't say much, but when he did, his words lingered in her mind long after he was gone. And then there were the small, dangerous moments. A touch that lasted a second too long. A glance held just a little too intensely. The way his lips would curve in a knowing smirk when he caught her staring at him. Elena told herself she could handle it, that she wouldn't let this go any further. But the pull between them was undeniable. And then, one evening, everything changed. Richard had left for a business trip, leaving Elena alone in the vast, empty house. Rain lashed against the windows, thunder rumbling in the distance as she curled up on the couch with a book, trying to ignore the storm outside and the one brewing inside her. She wasn't expecting company. But then she heard footsteps. She looked up just as Damien appeared in the doorway. His shirt was slightly damp from the rain, his dark hair messily tousled, his expression unreadable. "You're up late," he said. Elena swallowed, closing her book. "Couldn't sleep." He stepped closer. "You're not afraid of storms, are you?" She shook her head. "No." "Then what is it?" His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous in the way he asked. Elena hesitated. "I don't know." A lie. She knew exactly what it was. It was him. Damien studied her for a long moment, then took another step forward. "You sure about that?" The air between them shifted. She should have gotten up, should have walked away, should have ended whatever this was before it began. But when Damien reached out, just barely, his fingers brushing against hers on the couch, she didn't pull away. And neither did he. It was the smallest of touches, but it felt electric. A silent confession of everything they had both been denying. And in that moment, Elena knew this was the beginning of something neither of them could stop. The next day, Elena tried to avoid him. She buried herself in household tasks, trying to pretend the night before hadn't happened. But Damien wasn't pretending. He found her in the library later that afternoon, leaning against the doorway with that infuriating smirk. "Ignoring me now?" Elena didn't look up from the book in her lap. I don't know what you're talking about. He let out a soft chuckle. Right. She turned the page, forcing her voice to stay steady. Last night was nothing. Damien walked further into the room, his voice dropping lower. Then why are you so nervous? She finally met his gaze, frustrated by how easily he saw through her. Because this is wrong, Damien. He didn't argue, didn't deny it. Instead, he sat down beside her on the couch, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body. Tell me you don't feel it, he murmured. Elena's heart pounded. She couldn't, because she did, and that terrified her more than anything. That evening, Elena paced her bedroom, hands shaking. She needed to stop this, needed to end whatever was happening between them before it went too far. So when she heard the knock on her door, her breath caught. She already knew who it was. She hesitated, then, against every instinct, against every warning in her mind, she opened the door. Damien stood there, his dark eyes burning with something she wasn't ready to name. Elena, he said softly. She should have told him to leave, should have slammed the door shut, but she didn't. Instead, she stood there, caught in the pull of something inevitable. And then Damien took a step forward, and everything changed. The moment Elena opened the door, she knew she was making a mistake. Damien stood there, rain-dampened and dangerous in the dim light of her bedroom. His dark eyes held hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But the air between them was thick with everything left unsaid. And then, slowly, he stepped inside. Elena should have stopped him. She should have ended this before it began. But when Damien reached for her, his fingers grazing her wrist, a shiver ran through her body. It was too late. There was no going back now. Surrender. She didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was her. All she knew was that 1 second, there was hesitation, and the next, there was the heat. Damien's hands found her waist, pulling her against him. His touch was firm, confident, nothing like the careful, distant way Richard touched her. This was undeniable. A fire that had been burning too long, finally unleashed. Elena, he murmured against her skin, his voice rough with something she couldn't name. She should have stopped this. She didn't. Instead, she let herself sink into him, into the warmth, the need, the sheer recklessness of it all. For the first time in years, she felt alive. For the first time in years, she didn't care about the consequences. But consequences always came. And when they did, they were unforgiving. The days that followed were a blur. Elena had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She told herself it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But that was a lie, because it did happen again, and again. Late at night, when the house was quiet. In stolen moments when Richard wasn't home. Every time she swore it was the last, Damien would pull her back in with a glance, a touch, a whispered promise. They were playing a dangerous game, and it was only a matter of time before they got caught. One evening, as Elena sat in the garden with a book in her lap, she felt it. A shift. Richard had been watching her more closely lately. His usual indifference was replaced with something else. Suspicion. And then at dinner, he finally said it. You've been distracted lately. Elena's heart pounded. What? Richard set down his wineglass, studying her with unreadable eyes. You and Damien. The word sent a jolt of fear through her. She forced a laugh. What about us? Richard tilted his head. You seem close. Elena gripped the edge of the table. Was this a test? Did he know? Or was he just guessing? Either way, she had to be careful. She forced herself to meet his gaze. He's my stepson, Richard. What exactly are you implying? For a long moment, he said nothing. Then finally, he sighed. Nothing. Forget I said anything. But the doubt in his eyes lingered, and Elena knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. That night, as she lay awake in bed, she heard footsteps outside her door. Software hesitant. She knew exactly who it was, and despite everything, despite the risk, despite the fear, she got up. Opening the door, she found Daman standing there, his expression dark and unreadable. Elena, he murmured. She reached for him before she could stop herself, her fingers tangling in his shirt, pulling him inside. But the moment the door shut behind them, the weight of it all crashed down on her. This has to stop, she whispered. Daman searched her eyes. Do you want it to? She should have said yes, but when he touched her, when he kissed her, soft and slow, as if he already knew the answer, she realized the truth. She didn't want to stop. And that was the real problem, because the more they risked, the closer they came to the moment when everything would come crashing down. The house was silent, too silent. Elena Carter sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers gripping the sheets, her breathing shallow. The weight of everything pressed against her chest. The choices she had made, the secrets she had buried, the love she had let consume her. And now, it had all come crashing down. Damian Hayes stood in the doorway, his jaw clenched, his eyes dark with something unreadable. Hurt? Regret? Love? She couldn't tell anymore. The storm outside rattled the windows, mirroring the chaos in her heart. Say something, she whispered. He exhaled sharply. What is there to say? She swallowed hard. That you still love me. A humorless chuckle escaped him. Love? He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Love isn't supposed to feel like this, Elena. It isn't supposed to come with secrets and guilt and consequences we can't escape. Her throat tightened. I never meant for any of this to happen. But it did. His voice was firm, yet there was an undeniable softness beneath it. And now what? Where does this end? She had asked herself that question 1,000 times. Did they keep hiding? Did they walk away? Or did they face whatever storm was coming together? But then, footsteps. Liam Carter, her husband, Damian's father. His voice cut through the air like a blade. Elena, Damian. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Liam stood in the dim hallway, his expression unreadable. Had he heard? Did he know? The weight of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine, and then he said something that made her blood run cold. I know everything. The walls closed in around her. Damian's fists clenched at his sides. Liam, save it. Liam's voice was eerily calm. I don't need to hear excuses. I just want to know one thing. His eyes darkened. Was it worth it? Silence. Elena's breath hitched. Was it? Had the stolen moments, the hidden touches, the whispered confessions, had they all been worth destroying a family? Damian's voice was quiet, but firm. I love her. Liam let out a slow, bitter laugh. Of course you do. For the longest moment, no one moved. And then, Liam turned and walked away. Just like that. No screaming, no anger. Just a quiet, irreversible kind of devastation. Elena felt her knees buckle. Damian, but he was already following. Wait! She reached for him, but he pulled away. I have to fix this, he murmured. Her chest tightened. And if you can't? His expression was unreadable. Then I have to live with it. And then, just like Liam, he was gone. The house was silent once again. But this time, it felt permanent. What would you have done if you were in Elena's shoes? Would you have chosen love or loyalty? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.